once they get in us, it's like a ticking time bomb. What we're talking about are chemicals that are now referred to as PFAS, and that's PFAS. That stands for per and polyfluoroalkylated substances.
Named Rob Bilott. Of Rob Bilott.
Robert Bilott, the underdog lawyer who took on the industrial giant Dupont Chemical.
My name's Mark Ruffalo, and I'm honored to play the role of Rob Bilott in the upcoming film Dark Waters.
Rob Bilott is the author of the book Exposure and an inspiration for the movie Dark Waters.
And this is global contamination of these man-made toxins on a scale and scope I don't think we've seen ever before.
It's important to know that there's a man named Rob Bilott, and he's a huge reason why the world is a safer place.
These chemicals have been linked to a massive array of health issues. High exposure to these two major PFAS alone have been linked to high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, pregnancy-induced hypertension, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, and decreased response to vaccines.
Why everyone should be so worried about it?
They get into living things, and they tend to get into animals and humans, where they then stay in our blood.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of On to the Next Quarter, where I bring to you individuals who have impacted my life and I hope can impact yours as well. Today, I would like to introduce you all to someone who's not only my hero, the hero of a small town, city, or nation, but instead a hero to all of humanity. He is known as Dupont's worst nightmare. The individual I'm speaking of is Mr. Robert Bilott. He is a world-renowned lawyer who has been working in Taft Stettinius Hollister LLP and has received Taft's Legacy Award. He has been litigating a case for over 20 years against Dupont for their continuous pollution within our environment, our bodies, and our drinking water. Mr. Bilott has received the International Rights Livelihood Award in 2017 for his continuous work on PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. He is also sought out for his expertise in these chemicals and has been a guest speaker in the committees of the European Union and United Nations. Besides saving the world, he is also an author of the book Exposure: Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's Fight Against Dupont. He is also the inspiration for the movie Dark Waters, as well as the documentary The Devil We Know. Mr. Bilott's story has shown me the true meaning of selflessness and continuous sacrifice for the greater good of others. Mr. Bilott, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking this time out and speaking with us.
Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I think I'm still a little bit starstruck or in awe that I'm sitting in front of you and speaking with you, because it was just a couple of years ago that my family and I accidentally fell upon your movie Dark Waters, and since then I never would have thought that one movie would change the trajectory of my life, and I would be here in this moment right now speaking with you. And as I had mentioned before, I am a huge admirer of your work, and because of that I did my master's thesis on your work and I presented it at NYU. But after I presented it, I was shocked to find out that not a single one of my peers had ever heard about it. And so that's why I was so eager to have you on this show, just so we can continue to spread awareness.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for setting this up.
Of course, of course. And since we're on the topic of your movie, I just want to dive in and ask what that moment was like when Mark Ruffalo called you and was so inspired by your work that he wanted to create a movie on it.
Yeah, it was pretty surreal, to have somebody like him reaching out, and I really kind of had to question, was this really happening? At the time we were in active litigation, and still dealing with trials and trying to make sure that this story got out to not only the public, but to the scientific community, to regulators, and doing everything we could to lay the facts out in the public domain so people could start taking steps to protect people from this public health threat. So, I got a call one day, and Mr. Ruffalo had reached out saying he had read this article in the New York Times Magazine and was shocked that, here was a story talking about contamination that had been going on in the United States for decades and was still going on. And he considered himself active in environmental issues, particularly on water issues, and he had never heard of this. He had never heard the story. And he was particularly shocked to see that it was in the New York Times Magazine. And he was asking, why isn't this on the front page of the New York Times? Why is this story not being reported? Why does nobody know about this? And really started, trying to find a way to say, how do we bring this out to the rest of the world? How do we get this story out there? And propose the idea of doing a film. And at the time, when I looked at this, I still believed, and I still believe to this day, that this is a massive public health threat that people weren't aware of. Nobody knew this was happening. So if that's what it took, to help get this story out, I wanted to support doing that. And that led to, Mark working with the folks at Participant Media, a tremendous director, Todd Haynes, an unbelievable cast that was assembled that did, I think, a tremendous job taking a pretty complicated story spanning over 20 years with a lot of science, a lot of complicated legal issues and things going on, but presenting it in a way that really conveyed what was happening to real people in real communities that were dealing with this problem. And I think hopefully, through the film, people saw a story of what can happen when one person stands up, speaks out, and demands that things change. Might take a long time, but it's worth it. In the end, that results in tremendous change. What Mr. Tennant, the farmer, that was the subject of the film and in the story here, what he put in motion is now leading to laws being changed worldwide. So I think they did a great job, and really, I couldn't have asked for a better group of people.
Oh, that's amazing. And that dives straight into my next question regarding the movie. Was, like you said, it went into a lot of detail, and I felt like it did a really good job of depicting everything that happened, especially for somebody who might not have a background in law or in public health or in the scientific community. So I feel like it really puts everything into perspective. But I wanted to dive into your autobiography, Exposure. And in the beginning, there's a quote that says, "They want to keep everything hushed up, like it's some kind of big secret. They won't tell us what it is. They don't want me to talk because I'm an old dumb farmer and I'm not supposed to know anything. But it is not going to be covered up because I'm going to bring it out into the open for people to see." Wilbur Earl Tennant. Can you give me a little more insight into who Wilbur Tennant was and why he's the start of your autobiography?
Yeah, Mr. Tennant was really an amazing person. He and his whole family, really, as I mentioned, put things into motion that are changing the world and changing the way in which we address chemicals and our legal system and the way science is generated. And, he was incredibly passionate about, protecting his family and his community and his animals. He reached out to me in 1998, 24 years ago, trying to find out what was happening to his cows as he was watching them get sicker and sicker after drinking white foaming water coming into his creek. And he was convinced, he knew what the problem was. He could see this white foam coming out of a landfill owned by Dupont next to his property. But he couldn't get answers from anybody. The state wasn't helping, the federal EPA wasn't helping, the local company, and then the folks locally in town, a lot of the lawyers didn't want to get involved because it involved Dupont, one of the biggest employers in town. But that didn't deter him. He was determined that there was something in that water making these animals sick, and he was really concerned that it was also making him sick, his wife, his daughters, and was going to get to the bottom of it. And, you know, when I first met him and took on his case and tried to help him, you know, from the early days, I was sort of skeptical of whether there was anything really going on here, you know, and there was really the kind of problem he envisioned. But his determination and his passion of saying, you know, no, we need to keep digging into this. You know, we can't just accept what the US EPA says, that there's no problem here, nothing to be concerned about, or what US EPA, or what the state is saying, or the company. And he was right. And it was that passion and determination that really propelled me, you know, to look deeper and deeper into these documents. And then, you know, as the story unfolded and became bigger and bigger, and we realized we were dealing with something that wasn't just impacting Mr. Tennant and his family, but was impacting the whole world. You know, it was I could hear his voice in the back of my head, constantly saying, we just need to find a way to get this story out to everyone. Once they see this, people will know this needs to change, this needs to be fixed. And that's really what kept me going for a number of years.
Yeah, so as I've learned previously in school, that usually big companies, they establish themselves in smaller communities, and because of that they're able to provide jobs, education, all of that. So it kind of starts building a community trust, right? So that's why it was difficult for anyone in the surrounding area or any lawyers to take on that case. And he came to you from West Virginia all the way over here, even though you were a corporate lawyer who was technically supposed to be defending these large chemical companies. But then what happened when he came to you? What was the reason why you were like, you know what, let me take on this case? Because this was pretty early on in your career, right? He was the first client that you were bringing into Taft. So how were you like, you know what, you were changing, that would make you from going to a corporate lawyer to a plaintiff lawyer. And I don't know correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think many people make that shift.
Yeah, you know, it was definitely an evolution. Yeah. You know, I had spent 8 years here at the firm, really kind of learning the environmental world, environmental law, federal, state rules, regulations, and a lot of what I was doing up to that point had been working with big companies, big chemical companies. And so, you know, when I got the initial call from Mr. Tennant, and he started telling me cows were dying and I needed to help him, I was about to hang up the phone. I mean, that's not what I did. I was helping companies. But it was the family connection. It was when he said, I got your name from your grandmother, and he pointed out he was from Parkersburg. That made me at least pause and listen a little more closely to what was happening here. And that was really sort of the beginning of a whole series of events and things that just had to align just the right way for this whole story to have unfolded the way it did. Beginning with the fact, you know, that my mom had grown up in Parkersburg, and that my grandmother had been on the phone with Mr. Tennant's neighbor, you know, bragging about me being an environmental lawyer that could help him. That got me to a point of at least taking the call. And then, you know, being able to go out there and visit the family and see what was happening. And the fact that, frankly, I was at this law firm with the people here that allowed me to take that case on and to bring a case against a big chemical company at the time. And other events that occurred over the next 20 years. So it was definitely an evolution process. And I didn't when Mr. Tennant first came into my office, I had no idea that what he was asking me to help him with was going to end up involving a chemical that was in everyone's drinking water or everyone's blood across the entire planet, and involve countless consumer products and different materials that are used all over the world. I thought I was dealing with one small case for one family in one small town that was going to be pretty quick to resolve. And it was only as I dug into it and started working with Mr. Tennant closer and closer and going through this, that we started to understand the full scope and scale of what we were dealing with. So that was a gradual process that took some time for me to get there.
So for people who might not be familiar with what this chemical is, PFAS, PFOA, forever chemicals, there's C8, there's so many different names that people refer to it by. Could you just tell us what it is and why everyone should be so worried about it?
Sure. What we're talking about are chemicals that are now referred to as PFAS, and that's PFAS. That stands for per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, which is quite a mouthful. You also see them referred to in the shorthand forever chemicals. And what we're talking about is a class of chemicals. There could be now, what people are estimating, up to 10,000 in this class of chemicals. And they're all characterized by a fairly common chemical structure of having carbon attached to fluorine, making an organic fluorine molecule. And they can range from having 1 or 2 carbons to 8 to 9 to 10. So you hear them also referred to as things like C8 or C6 or C9. And the 2 chemicals that we know the most about in this family are the ones that have 8 carbons, the C8s. And those are chemicals known as PFOA, and that's the chemical I was primarily dealing with Mr. Tennant and with Dupont, but there was a sister chemical known as PFOS, also with 8 carbons. Both of these chemicals were essentially invented by the 3M company in Minnesota around the time of World War II, when 3M invented this way of connecting carbons to fluorine. 3M started using PFOS primarily in its own products, things like Scotchgard, and then in later years firefighting foams. But this PFOA, they were primarily selling that to one company, Dupont. And Dupont was using it to make Teflon. So these chemicals have this unique carbon-fluorine structure, makes them really strong. So they're useful in a lot of different manufacturing processes. That's why Dupont was using it to help make Teflon. But they've been used in all kinds of other manufacturing processes. Anything that's really stain-resistant or waterproof, like waterproof cosmetics or stain-resistant clothing or carpeting or fast food wrappers and packaging, computer chips, dental floss, non-stick, that kind of thing. But these chemicals are really strong, which makes them useful in all these products, but also that makes them very difficult to break down once they get out into the natural world. That's why you hear them referred to as forever chemicals. These 2 that we know the most about, the C8s, once they get out into the world, if they get out into the air or into the water or into the soil, we've had the company scientists testify it may take thousands, if not millions of years for those chemicals to start to break down on their own. That's why you call them forever chemicals. Once they're out there, they stay there. And one of the most disturbing aspects of that, once they get out in the environment, not only do they stay in the soil and the water, they get into living things. And they tend to get into animals and humans, where they then stay in our blood and they build up over time. And so what we've learned, unfortunately, over the years is not only are they persistent, bioaccumulative, but they're also very toxic, and now we know also carcinogenic. So you've got this combination of completely man-made chemicals that never existed on the planet prior to World War II that are now out there in our air, in our soil, in our water, in us, that persist, build up over time, and have all of these potentially toxic effects. So you hear also kind of it referred to now as once they get in us, it's like a ticking time bomb, because these chemicals circulate throughout our body, in our blood, coat all of our organs, and that's why we're now finding they have been linked with all kinds of different adverse health effects, from cancers to immune system impacts to potentially now even decreasing effectiveness of vaccines. You know, while we're dealing with COVID, here are chemicals that we now know are in the drinking water all over the planet, in the blood of virtually every person on the planet, and they could be having this kind of effect. So the scientific community is really concerned the more we learn about this. And so the acceptable levels of these chemicals in water or in the environment, we see them dropping lower and lower and lower because of the concern about their impact.
Yeah, but the acceptable levels, I mean, I was looking in New York City, is still 10 parts per trillion, which is huge because I know that Dupont had said 1 part per billion is a toxic amount, right?
Yeah, if you look at the history here, really the first people to ever sit down and try to figure out what would be a safe level of PFOA, one of these C8s, the one that Dupont was using, what would be a safe level in human drinking water? When Dupont scientists sat down to try to figure that out, this is back in the 1980s, and keep in mind it wasn't regulated, there were no government standards because the government agencies didn't even know about the chemical. This is all being covered up and withheld by the companies. But DuPont scientists were concerned enough about it to try to figure out what's a safe level. They had calculated no more than about 0.6 parts per billion, which they rounded up to 1 part per billion. But the significance of that number back then, 0.6 parts per billion was about as low as you could detect it in the water at the time. So when the DuPont scientists were looking at it back in the 1980s, they were essentially saying, if we can detect it, we're concerned. And now, what we're seeing, just last summer, the US EPA came out with updated drinking water guidelines for PFOA. And they said no more than 0.004 parts per trillion. The current lowest level you can detect it in the water is now around 2 to 4 parts per trillion. So US EPA has now finally come to the same point DuPont was at decades ago, where they're essentially saying, if you can detect it, we're concerned from a health standpoint. And US EPA is moving forward right now to finally set enforceable drinking water standards. We're still waiting for that. But right now, this health guideline has generated a lot of concern because if you go out and start sampling for this chemical, essentially, any detectable amount now is arguably above the EPA guideline. And even we're finding that this chemical is being found in the rain when across the planet. We're finding it in Arctic ice. We're finding it in polar bear blood. It's because this stuff is falling in the rain, and in some cases, the levels in the rain can exceed the new health guidelines.
Wow, I did not know. I was already shocked when I found out that you can find it in polar bear blood. When I read that, I was like, that's crazy. Like, how is it getting over there? But now to find out that it's in the rain too, that's pretty, that's scary.
Well, you know, it's really troubling because it took over 20 years for this story, to finally come out to the public, the scientific community, regulators, about the dangers from one of these PFAS chemicals, PFOA, all right, the C8 we've been talking about. So that one finally has started to be phased out, and at least it's not being manufactured in the United States anymore. But what's happened is that manufacturing's moved overseas. And some of this is still happening over there. And unfortunately, these chemicals move rapidly through the environment. They move through the water. They move through the air. They can get up into the air from wherever they're manufactured, get into the clouds, in the water droplets, and then fall in the rain. So they don't respect national boundaries. They don't respect state boundaries. So wherever they're manufactured in the world, they can contribute to this global contamination. So that's why we're seeing a lot of efforts now being undertaken internationally to try to regulate these chemicals. And in fact, just last week, the European Union proposed a total ban of all PFAS, which was significant. And the 3M company, the company that invented these chemicals, just announced they will not make any of them anymore in the next couple of years. So that was, I think that sends a real strong message out there that the science is in on the dangers and concerns about these chemicals. And this is global contamination of these man-made toxins on a scale and scope I don't think we've seen ever before.
And just to like backtrack a little bit, this all began because Dupont, well, it started with 3M, but then Dupont started advertising this non-slip cookware and Teflon, and you know, it was like easy to use, and the workers started getting contaminated, and then eventually everyone else did. But the thing was that you were the first person who found out outside of Dupont, right? Like you said, nobody else knew. The government, the EPA, nobody knew. You found out when Mr. Tennant had his suspicions because his cows were getting sick and the water was foaming up and it was dirty. But what exactly, so how did it get into the environment, right? Dupont was dumping the waste into the water supply, and that's how it started getting everyone sick and how it started getting into the water supply initially?
Yeah, actually, various ways. What happened is, you know, 3M invents these chemicals around World War II. DuPont starts buying PFOA from 3M as early as 1951. Okay, and that chemical starts getting shipped down to this factory in West Virginia, where DuPont is starting to, at that point, develop this product called Teflon for things like nonstick pans. Well, the Teflon brand in these nonstick pans really launches in the US around 1961, 1962. So at that point, they start getting much higher volumes of this material sent down to the plant. And they start using it in the manufacturing of this chemical, of this product, Teflon. And in the manufacturing process, as this chemical is used and there's heating and all of this, some of that gets emitted up into the air through smokestacks coming out of the plant. So it goes into the air and then it falls in the rain on the other side of the Ohio River in Ohio. Or liquid waste from the manufacturing get dumped directly into the Ohio River through a pipe. And then there's also wastewater sludge and biosolids that are created through this process. And what DuPont was doing at the time was simply digging pits around the property and dumping this sludge into unlined pits where it would then seep into the ground and eventually into the groundwater. So you had this chemical being used in massive quantities, particularly by the 1960s. And it was being emitted into the air, into the water, into the ground, and then wastes were going to landfills. So it was getting out in multiple ways. Not to mention, some of it remained in the product as that product went out. So you started getting this massive contamination around the plant. And unfortunately, if you look at this timeline, people wonder, well, why wasn't this regulated? You know, why was this happening? There were no restrictions on this. The US EPA doesn't come into existence until 1970. The first federal laws really regulating what kinds of tests you have to do on chemicals before they go out on the environment, 1976. So this is happening decades before. And so by the time those laws roll out, they really focus on new chemicals from that point forward. For existing ones like PFOA, which was already being used, the companies were essentially told it's up to them to tell the EPA if there's some reason they need to go back and look at it. And unfortunately, what we see here, the companies had lots of information suggesting there was a problem and chose not to tell the EPA. And it wasn't until we brought our lawsuit for Mr. Tennant and we're trying to figure out what happened to the cows that that information ever got provided to EPA. And it's because we provided it to them.
Right, and so the DuPont scientists they were knowingly dumping these chemicals in these different ways, despite knowing the toxic effects it had, because they were doing tests on rats, on monkeys, on bats, and they saw that it causes different deformities, especially in fetuses, that it has carcinogenic effects, and that it's toxic and essentially lethal in higher doses. Yet they were still okay doing that for so many years.
Yeah, if you go back and look at the chronology here, and I try to really lay that out a little more detail in the book, exposure. By the 1960s, when they first started looking at this, that's when they were doing all of these animal studies. They were studying rats, mice, dogs, guinea pigs, rabbits, and eventually even monkeys. And they were finding toxic effects in these different animal species and different organ systems, incredibly toxic effects. And that's in the 1960s. By the 1970s, they realized this stuff would get into people who were exposed. They had found out, 3M and Dupont had both found out, this chemical was being found in the general US population's blood. They were aware of this by the late 1970s. Even when those laws started to come out that said you need to tell the EPA if there's some threat to the companies knew this and didn't say anything. And then by the 1980s, that's when the first cancer results came out from the rat studies, showing the chemical causes tumors. And again, that data wasn't provided. Dupont had even studied the pregnancy outcome of female workers at the plant and found birth defects and didn't report that to the EPA. So there was animal data, there was human data. Then Dupont even started tracking cancer rates in the workers. 3M did as well. That data wasn't provided. So there was all this accumulating data showing toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic. And then the most disturbing thing was not only did they have this data, they then found out it's in the drinking water of the entire surrounding community. They knew that by 1984. And this information, again, wasn't provided. And so it really, when we started digging into the documents and finding this out, we realized this is in people's drinking water, tens of thousands of people. It's toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic. Nobody's been told this. And realizing we might be the only people who had seen these documents outside the company.
Wow. And what's even more worrisome is that it can be found in newborn babies even though they haven't even touched or used anything technically that has this chemical, but it could just be passed on from the mother to the fetus.
Yeah, that's a really disturbing aspect of these chemicals. As I mentioned, these forever chemicals, when they get out into the environment, they stay in the soil, they stay in the air for thousands of, millions of years in drinking water or soil. But when they get into people, a lot of chemicals that we're exposed to, our body gets rid of pretty quickly. Like I'm drinking this coffee, this caffeine will be gone in a matter of hours. But other chemicals we're exposed to, they might deposit, like to fat, or stay someplace where they don't have a lot of opportunity to do harm. Mm-hmm. These chemicals, these man-made chemicals, our bodies don't know how to process them. We don't know how to get rid of them. And what happens is they have this unique ability to stick to our blood and stay in our bodies and build up in the blood. And unfortunately, what we also have found is that crosses the human placenta. So when somebody is pregnant, that chemical is transferred right over to the baby in the womb. And so you end up with children that are born pre-polluted now. So our generation is passing these chemicals on to children at birth. And unfortunately, we're finding that some of the highest levels are actually in the newborns or in the elderly people because of the way in which these chemicals behave in the body. So that's again another reason why public health officials are so concerned about these chemicals and warning that we need to be taking steps to deal with them.
Yeah, wow. And that's scary because, babies that are born with high doses of this chemical, it was shown, right, that there was 2 Dupont workers, females, who their babies were born with birth defects because of exposure to these chemicals.
Well, if you go back in the history here, in 1981, 3M had done some research with rats exposed to the chemical PFOA, and they had found that the baby rats had eye defects, and they had alerted Dupont to this. And Dupont went out and said, well, we need to see whether or not any of the children that have been born to workers that are using this chemical on the Teflon line, do any of them have eye or facial defects? And they found that there had been 7 babies that had been born to the women on the line. And they even calculated like what would be a statistically significant number of birth defects here. And they had found that if we have, you know, even just a couple, that's a real problem. Well, they looked and they found 2 out of the 7 had given birth to babies that had issues with the eyes or birth defects. And Dupont, unfortunately, rather than write that up and report that, they never finished that study. They never told the EPA about that. Instead, they went back to the original rat study and had the 3M redo the rat study and say, oh, well, the original study must have been just an error in the way we prepared the eyes. We've done this second study on rats, no problem. So all the women were told they could go back to working on Teflon. Nobody ever told the public or the governmental agencies that Dupont had looked at humans and had found these eye defects. So it wasn't until our litigation where we found these documents and I provided them to the US EPA. US EPA eventually sued Dupont, saying, this is information you should have disclosed to us. The fact that this can cross the human placenta and be passed on to children, that's a significant issue you should have told us years ago.
Yeah, wow. And I was recently looking at this, ABC News was like covering your story a while back, and so I was just looking at the interview, and they had gotten a statement from Dupont regarding the movie and the documentary, and Dupont stated, nothing is more important than the safety of our employees and the communities in which we operate. Unfortunately, this movie misrepresents things that has happened years ago. In some cases, the film depicts wholly imagined events. So my question is Dupont still trying to deny what has been done despite the research that has been shown and proven in court over and over and over again?
Unfortunately, yes. You know, as we've learned that this chemical and these sister chemicals are being found in drinking water all over the planet, and new communities are finding out they've been exposed, Dupont and 3M, you know, are continuing to deny the science and continuing to deny responsibility for damage from these chemicals. You know, so it's pretty pretty frustrating. And I will note with that particular statement that was made, you'll notice that there's no reference to any specific fact that was allegedly incorrect in the film. And in fact, you know, they took great pains in making the film to make sure that we stuck to the facts, we stuck to what actually happened. And that's one of the reasons I did the book Exposure as well. I wanted folks to have the full factual background of what really happened, so that if somebody stood up and said, this never occurred, you know, there never was a science panel, or these links with disease were never found, we would have a resource that people could see for themselves what actually happened.
Right, you go in so much detail, you back everything up with the different documents that you could discuss, that you could disclose, all the scientific facts. You explain the whole timeline so well. Everything is backed up and by experiences and by other individuals that also worked with you, right? You mentioned so many different individuals that stood with you in this fight, but it took a long time because before it was just you and Mr. Tennant, because in the beginning, nobody really believed you guys, or it was hard to get people to stand with you because they didn't want to upset Dupont.
Yeah, it's been very difficult, you know, to get this story out and for people to understand why it's important to them as well. You know, I think for a long time, people assumed this is just some isolated issue involving some cows in West Virginia. This has nothing to do with us in New York or in California or in Italy or Germany or Japan. This is an irrelevant story. And you know, I think part of the problem has been the nature of the chemical. You know, this is something you don't see, taste, smell. You know, it's, and these are chemicals that nobody can even pronounce. You know, it's not like we're dealing with lead or arsenic or something that immediately people understand what we're talking about and why that's a concern. And the terminology keeps changing. You know, when I first started working on this, these chemicals were referred to as C8 because that's what Dupont called it. Then we saw people start talking about FCs, and then we started hearing about fluoropolymers or fluorochemicals, and then it was PFCs, and now we're talking about PFAS. And so it's taken a long time for people to understand those stories that were coming out 20 years ago about C8s and that's all the same thing. This is all the same story. These are the same chemicals. It's just different names that have been applied. Yeah. And we've seen a pretty deliberate strategy over the years of using different terminology so that when information's provided to the government, for example, somebody will claim, well, we told them, you know, here's the reference to the, but it's referred to 6 different ways. So folks getting this information had no idea, well, this study related to the same thing over here, this is the same chemical. And it's just been a very difficult process for people to understand what is this stuff, what do we know about it, and to start connecting the dots and seeing that these situations we're seeing popping up in the water in California or in the water in Italy, this is all the same stuff made by the same companies. We're just calling it different things. It's been a difficult process, but having a film like Dark Waters or the documentary The Devil We Know has been incredibly helpful in helping, I think, focus people and help them understand this is all related.
Yeah. So what can people do that are now finding out about this and are probably like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. Where do I begin? What water can I drink? Like, what do I use? What do I not use? How was it, one, figuring it out? When you first figured it out, like, what lifestyle changes did you make or could you suggest to other people that can try limiting this exposure?
Yeah. It's difficult. It's difficult to do that because even now, these chemicals, generally speaking, are still not really regulated. You know, we're starting to get there. There are some states that are moving forward in adopting laws, in California, for example, or in Maine, and other states that are starting to really try to address this. At the federal level, things are still moving. You know, we're getting some progress, but we still are moving slowly internationally as well. And so because of that, it's really difficult for the average consumer to know what products were these chemicals even in. And unfortunately, what we have found is a lot of the time the companies sort of downstream that have been getting these materials and then using them in their products, they didn't even know that these chemicals were there because the makers of the PFAS chemicals, they knew all of this information, but they weren't passing that along. For example, with firefighting foam. You know, PFOA and PFOS were used in aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, a type of firefighting foam used for petroleum fires for decades. Well, when that stuff was sold, people were told to just go out and spray it all over the place. Nobody was told it has PFAS in it. And if you do that, it's going to get into the ground. It's going to get into the groundwater. Firefighters weren't told that their turnout gear, you know, was coated with stain-resistant waterproof chemicals that may be absorbed. So this information didn't make its way down the chain, so to speak. So what's happening now is people find out, hey, these chemicals are out there. They're trying to find out what products have they been used in. It's still not on ingredient labels. They're still not on, you know, warning labels. So it's difficult. So there are a number of groups that are out there trying to help people understand what types of products should I look for. Groups like the Green Science Policy Institute, the Environmental Working Group, Safer States, Toxics Action Network. These are groups that are saying, here are the types of products that have contained these chemicals. And importantly, here are companies that are coming forward and saying, we're no longer going to use those, or we're committed to transition away. So you can start making a choice. And up to now, none of us have had a choice because we didn't know we were being exposed. And we don't know which products have these things. So with these companies coming forward, even before the laws are changing, the market forces are now driving this change because consumers are saying, we don't want them in our products. We want to switch to something that doesn't have them. That's forcing the change. That's making companies come forward and switch away. So the information's only slowly trickling out there, and it's not easy to find. But the best thing you can do is really try to educate yourself and look for things, certain buzzwords like non-stick, waterproof, stain resistant, because historically, those are the kinds of things that PFAS have been used in. So it's still a difficult process to really know where you've been exposed.
Wow. And you said we were essentially unknowingly being poisoned. And I know you gave the example one time with people who might smoke cigarettes, and we know that tobacco is cancerous, yet people can make that choice if they want to use that product or not. But here, it was like, we don't have a choice, right?
Correct. None of us were told. We weren't told we were being exposed to these chemicals. And in fact, for years, as we were trying to make information available, there was pushback saying, this isn't true. You know, the science isn't there. These chemicals aren't linked with any problems. Don't worry about this. So not only was the information not provided, but counter information was provided to mislead the public for decades about this. So, you know, it's a very different situation. None of us knew we were being exposed. We were all essentially being used in a massive human health experiment without our permission. Because it's not much different than if somebody had come up and injected you with this, put it into your body, put it into your blood without your permission. And now we're told, well, we need to sit back and wait and see how many people get sick, how many people develop cancer. And we're being told, a lot of times, unfortunately, in the U.S. legal system, the way it works with burden of proof and how you, essentially, the people who are exposed are told, you have to wait until you've got enough evidence showing enough people are sick before you can move forward and try to stop it. And that's again, another reason I really wanted to do the book, was to help people understand these burdens are placed in the wrong way in a lot of times. Those of us who are exposed to these things in our environment, how do we have the ability to prove these things are causing this harm? A lot of times it takes massive studies. If you look at PFOA, tens of thousands of people participated in these studies. It took millions and millions of dollars. Most exposed people don't have those resources to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go into a little bit about that, about the class action lawsuit, right, that you did. It was the biggest public health study that was conducted, around 70,000 individuals, so that you could try proving and showing that there is a link to PFOA and certain diseases. And around this time, I believe this started around 2005, if I'm... So like you, my family also moved around quite a bit when we were younger due to my dad's occupation. And so we were actually living in West Virginia in between 2003 and 2005. So while all of this was happening, we were living in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is just an hour out from Parkersburg. And it is just so surprising that while we were living there and so much is going on, we didn't even hear about it at all. And we're still drinking this water. And in Wheeling is when my mom actually got diagnosed with thyroid, which is one of the 6 diseases that you were able to prove in that study links to PFOA, correct?
Yeah, you know, it's been frustrating because even to this day, I think you're going to find that there are, you know, a number of people, even in the communities you would think should know the most about this, that are directly impacted with these chemicals in their water or nearby, that there's so many people that have never heard of this and still have no idea what these chemicals are or why there's an issue or what they need to be concerned about. It has been very difficult to bring this story out, or to have, frankly, the media, most of the media, pay any attention to it. Because again, it's such a complex issue. And unfortunately, a lot of what we used to have decades ago, investigative journalists, who could really dig into these. We had some great investigative journalists over the years with PFOA, folks like Sharon Lerner or, Nathaniel Rich and others that wrote some great, and Michael Hawthorne, that did great investigative, in-depth pieces. You now are moving to this media world where everything has to be very short sound bites, and being able to convey information about something as complicated as this doesn't translate well into a 5-second sound bite. And attention spans are shorter.
Right.
People are just getting little blips, and they're not willing to read something that's very in-depth.
Yeah.
So it's difficult.
Can you tell us what were the 6 diseases that were linked with that study that you did?
Yes. We did this, we set up this independent panel of scientists. Really, that process began around 2005, as you mentioned, and was finished around 2012. And these scientists were allowed to look at all of the existing data, not just what was published, but also all of these internal studies, and they designed all of these new studies that were done in the community, 12 different massive studies. So they looked at all of this data, and at the end, they were able to confirm that drinking PFOA in the water was in fact linked with 6 different diseases: testicular cancer, kidney cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia or pregnancy-induced hypertension, and high cholesterol.
Wow. And this made me think about it while I was reading your book, that oftentimes, especially with these diseases, we feel that we might have a genetic disposition to them, that, oh, our family members had it, so obviously we're going to get it, that it's just genetics. But we don't realize that a lot of times there could be such huge environmental impacts that our genes might be completely okay, but because of what we're being exposed to on the outside and because the community we might be living in, it just makes sense that everyone in our family or everyone in the community would be getting sick. It's not necessarily something internally wrong with us.
Yeah, and that is a really complex area, to try to really kind of filter out exactly what is contributing to certain diseases. And something like this, having these man-made chemicals that are in the blood across the country, if not across the world, really throws a huge monkey wrench into analyzing all of this, disease patterns. Because when you think about it, when you try to set up studies looking at, hey, is this particular chemical causing disease in a group of humans, a group of actual people, you try to do that by comparing that group that's been exposed to an unexposed group, a control group. In this case, you've got almost the entire population already exposed to PFAS in the blood. So how do you ever find a, quote, clean or unexposed group? And so I think what people are just now starting to really kind of comprehend is that you may have global or countrywide health implications that people had previously dismissed, saying, well, that's just general population rates or that's background levels, where in fact we may be finding that may be caused by some of these chemicals because they're in the entire population. We saw a recent study that just came out looking at the health implications of PFAS in the United States, finding billions of dollars in healthcare costs on an annual basis, and looking at the potential deaths that may have been caused by PFAS since 1999, and found approximately 6 million deaths since 1999 just in the United States. And if you think about that, that's more than COVID. And so you start putting these things into perspective and you wonder, why are we not discussing this? Why are we not looking at this as not just an isolated instance of exposure in this one community, but global health implications from something like this?
Wow. That's crazy. I did not know that. Wow. I guess you've been now, I see it in the way you speak. You have so much passion and drive to get this information out there. And like you said, initially you thought it was just going to be one small little case. But if you had known back then that it was going to be over a 20-year fight, do you think you would have said yes?
You know, it's hard to say, you know, because I'll tell you, at the time, again, I thought this is just a small matter, you know, isolated case, wasn't going to drag on. But it's when I started to see the scope and scale of this and to realize the public health implications, I don't see how you could ever go back and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take that on. Yeah. So I can't imagine having done anything differently.
Wow, yeah. So I guess this kind of became, in a way, your life purpose, in a sense, to uncover this truth that Mr. Tennant had brought to you. And I know in the book, a lot of times you would mention your wonderful wife, Sarah, and your kids. And so I know that you're a huge family man, and I am as well. And for me, my parents are from California, but being far away from them while I'm trying to work on my purpose, I know can take a toll on me personally, and sometimes I feel really guilty. And I know that working this for over 20 years, it took away from time from your family. So how did you navigate this personally? And do you think there's a way to create balance while working towards your purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's not necessarily easy to do that, but you know, I think you can. And I was incredibly fortunate. You know, as I mentioned earlier, so many things had to align just the right way for this whole thing to have rolled out the way it did. And one of those was being married to my wife, Sarah. You know, having somebody who was also a lawyer that had been working at a big firm that understood what was going on, what I was working on, and also, you know, incredibly passionate about helping people and making sure that we're doing the right thing. And you know, my kids grew up during this case, and I think, you know, I would hope, you know, have been really taken some lessons from it. You know, I've got two of my sons right now that are. One of them just started law school, wants to be an environmental lawyer. The other is finishing up college, hoping to go to law school. My oldest is going to be an artist and help change the world, you know, through that. And so I think they've taken this on in their own ways, and it's great to watch.
I love that. So for individuals that are my generation, you know, probably the same age as your sons, what advice would you give to them when they're trying to find their purpose? Do you think that they need to seek it out, they need to be finding it, or like you, it kind of came to you?
You know, and my wife told me this at one point, and I've always, you know, I couldn't think of any truer words. You know, she said, you've got to be willing to step outside the comfort zone, you know, and be willing to accept and take on risks. And to know, you know, when you're at a point, a turning point, be willing to do that. Be willing to step outside of your comfort zone. Be willing to say, you know what, I've never done that, or nobody's ever done that before. Do it. You know, that's the only way things change. That's the only way we can make things better, is, you know, be willing to do something different. And you know, I'm hoping that when people see this story, you know, they realize that's worth that. It's worth the risk. You know, we ended up doing things that nobody had done. We set up massive scientific studies that nobody had really tried to do before. You know, brought cases and legal claims that were unique or innovative, and you know, helped try to change the way chemicals are addressed. And it's not always easy, yeah, but it's worth the effort. And just as long as you're willing to take that risk.
Yeah, and you took a very big risk, because I don't know if people understand how massive, how worldwide spread this chemical company was. Like, it's huge. It's not just like, you know, one small little corporation that you're taking on. It's a massive company, and you continuing to fight this case, even after you settled the tenant case, you essentially could have lost everything, you know, your career, your name, your status, time with your family, financial stability, yet you made the decision to continue this fight. And I know for you, it's just the right thing to do, but sometimes people get stuck between these crossroads, and not everyone will make that choice. So how did you do that, and what would you say to people who might be stuck in this type of a position?
You know, I guess you try to take a step back and just look at what's the ultimate objective, you know, not to try to get bogged down in the day-to-day battles or skirmishes that are going on, but just be able to step back and say, you know, what's going to keep me on the ultimate path that I want to be on, and be willing to keep focused that way and not get dragged down into the minor battles. And, you know, that's not always easy. And as you see in the film, Dark Waters, I talk about it in the book, you know, there were some very difficult times, particularly in our case when we had set up this big scientific panel and we're waiting for these results, had no idea it was going to stretch over 7 years. Mm-hmm. And it was that period of time when the economy is collapsing, you know, and people are losing their jobs and people in the community are dying. And so there's a lot of pressure. But you know, you just had to keep focusing on, at some point, this truth will come out and these things will change. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's worth the effort.
Yeah. There's this one interview I was watching with you and Mark Ruffalo where he says that Rob Bilott is a hero not because you want to be like him, but because you see how difficult it is to be him. And you've gone through a lot of different struggles and a lot of difficulties personally and, you know, in while fighting this case. But for you specifically, what was some of the most difficult times that now have, in hindsight, led to your success or that you were able to get out of?
You know, I think one of the most difficult was setting up this process to try to resolve this ultimate scientific question: can this chemical actually cause harm to people? Mm-hmm. And getting, you know, our clients and the community that we were representing to say, yes, you know, we'll agree to this process that you've set up. And then to watch that take so long, and to be hearing about people getting sick and people dying in the community that were trusting us and, you know, putting their faith in that this process would work, and not knowing, you know, whether it would work or whether it could be corrupted somehow, whether somebody would find a way to influence these scientists or things would be derailed. You know, that was a very difficult period of time. And, you know, I not only had the clients and the community, you know, that was depending on us, but, you know, my law firm as well. At, you know, and again, as I mentioned, difficult economic times while we were doing this. You know, raising 3 small children as well at the time. So that was probably one of the more stressful periods.
Yeah. Was there ever a time where you felt like you want to take a step back?
You know, there were points in time, again, that were sort of crossroads moments. I think I even used that term in the book, you know, where we could have stopped, or I could have said, okay, I've done what I set out to do. Let somebody else take it. Mm-hmm. You know, the first time was maybe, you know, when we finally got the settlement for Mr. Tennant and his family. Mm-hmm. And I had provided all this information to the US EPA. It would have been easy at that point to say, okay, I've given the government the information, let them do whatever they need to do. I've done what I needed to do. But I felt like, no, we needed to make sure that actually happened. Mm-hmm. And so we took on the next phase, you know, of the class action and setting the scientific panel up and making sure the science was finished. And again, once we settled that case and set that up, we could have said, okay, we're done. Let's let the science run its course, whatever. But I felt, again, I had to make sure we saw that through, and so that actually happened. And then even when that was done, mm-hmm. and we were able to then get compensation for the people who'd been injured and got cancer, We settled all those cases. We could have said, okay, now we're done. We've done what we needed to do for that community. But at that point, it was seeing this isn't just this community. This is all across the country. This is all across the world, and nobody knows about this yet. It's still going on. And, again, I think it would have been easy at that point to say, nothing more we can do, let the regulators and the scientists. But again, I guess sort of that voice of Mr. Tennant in the back of my head, saying, we've got to find a better way to convey this so that we will get to the point where globally people are recognizing this is something we need to be concerned about. Here are things we can do about it. And so kind of took that on. And now we're seeing, I think, we're getting there. Yeah. We're seeing, as I mentioned, the EU saying we're proposing to phase these out, 3M saying we're not going to make these anymore. So, and the laws are changing, and products are changing, and the whole way in which people are discussing chemical regulation is starting to change. So I see the potential there, so I want to stick that out as well. And I don't foresee that ending anytime soon.
That's good. So if Mr. Tennant were here today after, starting this so many years ago, and now seeing everything that you have done, what do you think he would say?
I think he'd be happy to see that the story has finally gotten out, and that people are seeing the truth, that people do have the ability to now take steps to protect themselves, that they have the opportunity he never had, mm-hmm. That they can start knowing what this stuff is and not to drink it or not to buy these products that have it in it. And that, again, that was the process he started, and I think he'd be glad to see that all of the sacrifice that he made, that his family made, that his community made, it was worth it.
Yeah. Before I get on to my closing questions, I just wanted to say thank you so much once again. I am so humbled to be in your presence, and for everyone that's looking at you and hearing this story, what can we do to help take your work forward?
Yeah, I think I would hope people realize that even one person, can make a huge difference. Somebody like Mr. Tennant or Mr. Kiger, in his community, that said, that may be the way we always did it, but that shouldn't be the way we do it. Or this is the way the law is, but that shouldn't be the way the law is. That one person can make a difference. One person who's persistent, focused, dedicated to making that change, it can happen. And it's hopefully an optimistic story for people to read or to watch, that shows that, those efforts make a difference.
Yeah. And so what would you say, I guess you kind of touched on it, would be the biggest lesson you would hope that anyone takes away from your journey?
Again, I would say always be willing to step outside the comfort zone. Take that risk, do something different, and never be afraid to speak up. And to demand things be changed. It doesn't matter how big the adversary is. You could be up against the biggest companies on the planet, the whole U.S. legal system, or the entire regulatory system. Those things can be changed, and there's never a reason not to try.
Yeah, and of course, anyone can see from your book, from your movie, or the documentary who you are and the work that you have done. But for you personally, who would you say that Rob Bilott is?
I guess I'm somebody who is incredibly thankful for the family that I've had, for the friends and colleagues, like here at the firm that have stood by me for 32 years, and the incredible clients that I've had the great fortune to work with people like Mr. Tennant or Mr. Kiger and the folks we're working with now all across the world, that are struggling with these issues. That somebody who's been greatly honored to work with the people I've had the chance to work with and to be surrounded by the people I'm fortunate enough to be sharing my life with.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you so much once again for inviting me here, allowing me to be here where the journey started. I think I was landing on the flight and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm in the movie. I'm traveling back in time. Like, this is so crazy. But I really, really appreciate your time and for you being so gracious with your time. And I just wanted to say that you are truly an inspiration to everyone. And I know that it was really hard to see that over the years, and it might have been very difficult when no results were coming about due to everything. But you are creating a domino effect within the younger generations, and it's amazing. You're going to go speak in Colombia. I feel like that's such a huge change to public health students. Like I said, I never got to learn about it, so I love that younger people are going to get the opportunity to learn about it and hopefully carry your work forward. And for everyone listening, I hope you learned something. Please go read the book, Exposure, go watch Dark Waters, go watch the documentary, because we barely scratched the surface. There is a lot more that goes into depth. And if it is okay with you, I was hoping to give some of my listeners a signed copy of your book.
Sure.
So yeah, so watch out for that. And thank you so much for joining this episode.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.